Well, hey, thanks for checking out another project video. My name is Mitch and this is Made by Mitch, and today I'm going to show you how I made this tapering jig. Let's check it out.
So a couple months ago I made this pedal board. On the sides of the pedal board I had to cut tapers to make up the sides, and so in this video I'm going to show you how I made the jig to make these tapers. The first thing I had to do was I had to rip the plywood down to size. Now I just used a scrap piece of 3/4 inch plywood, and then I used a scrap piece of maple and cut it to size to fit in the miter slot. That way I could run the jig along the miter slot. The next thing I had to do was make the slots for the bolts to go in. I'm using a flathead bolt, and so I had to make one groove with the router to let the bolt go all the way through, and then another one that the bolt could countersink in, so that way it would be flat with the bottom of the jig. To do this I just took little bits of the wood out at a time, that way I didn't go too much at once, and just took my time until I got this to fit perfectly. After the main piece was ready to go, now it was time to rip the top piece, and this piece would sit on top of the main piece of the jig, and then it would allow the bolts to run up and down the slots and create the angle that I needed. And so I did the same thing with this with a router. I just made some slots that the bolts would come up through. Next, I could assemble the toggle clamps I would use to hold down the workpiece when it's going through the table saw. And so these toggle clamps I got were a little bit too big, so I had to put in some spacers, that way it could reach the workpiece that I needed. And I just used some glue down this little scrap piece of wood, and then I used screws to drill them down to the jig. So after installing the toggle clamps, the last thing I had to do was I had to attach the main jig onto the board that would go in the miter slot. At first I just added a couple random pieces of sandpaper just to lift the board up, that way it would be able to attach to the jig the right way. And then I just set the jig on there and I put it where I needed it to go, and then I added some wood glue. Now when I did this part, I held this on there for a good amount of time, that way the glue would adhere to it, and then when I would pull the jig off, it would stay in place, because you don't want it to move when you're doing this part of it. And so the next thing I did, I just pre-drilled, and I used wood screws to put into this piece that would be in the miter slot, and then I also countersank these, that way it wouldn't drag across my table saw.
So now that we've assembled the jig, it's time to test it out. So the first thing I have to do is I have to mark on the board that I'm cutting where I want the taper, and then I'll put that board into the jig. So the first thing I have to do is loosen up these bolts so that way that this moves freely, and then I'll install the board. Now I've made some marks already, and I've determined which way it needs to go. You need to make sure that the scrap piece goes on the outside of the jig. So I've got my marks right here. Once the board is in place, then I move this guide up to it, and then I'll tighten it down.
And this is where my toggle clamps were a little bit too big, but it ended up being alright. I just put a scrap piece of wood on top of the workpiece, and then it worked just fine. And after the board is in place nice and tight, then you can make your cut.
Click right here to check out the pedal board that I built using this jig. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you in the next project.